by this time you should know what are you good at. They are ultimately looking at your ability to do something. You demonstrated those abilities. Other person is convinced that given the scenario, you are able to do that. Hello everybody, this is me Sajid and welcome to this video. In today's video, we are going to discuss a very common and at times overrated, but most of the time underrated topic. Today we are going to discuss about skills. What are skills? How do we categorize them? What is the difference between a skill and a talent? And how does skill and talent define our ability to do something? I'm not going to go into the details of what skills do we need to focus on, but we would generally categorize the skills in this video. So without further ado, let's get started. When we say skill is basically your ability to do something. I would come to this word again, but let me simplify it for you. So skill indirectly shows that what are you able to do. There is another term which is sometimes interchangeably used with skill, but there is a difference in there, and it is important highlighting that because it is important for career growth, and that is talent. Talent is not a skill. Talent is something that is your natural ability, something that you were born with. It is impossible on earth that someone does not have any talent. It is almost impossible. Everyone is born with a certain talent, and that talent could be anything. It could be having a good voice, it could be having good comprehension ability, and etc. So no one is born without any talent. Yes, it takes time for some to understand or bring the talent out of them. So when I talk about talent, so talent is your natural ability. However, skill is something that you learn over time. Now, of course, you polish your talent by learning skills. So basically, talent and skill could go hand in hand. And in total, your talent plus your skills defines your ability to do something. If I put it into mathematical form, skills plus your talent is equal to your ability. Now, let's assume for a moment that you say that, Sajid, I'm not talented at all. I have zero talent, no talent at all. And that means this value becomes zero. You only have a certain skill, and that you use that skill to show that you have this ability. So if I have to say that skill is equal to ability, it would be right in that specific scenario. I will come to talent a bit later in this video, but let's talk about skills first. So skill is basically defining your ability to do something. Skill is generally learned and practiced over time. It is polished over time. So the more time you spend with certain thing or in a certain skill, the better it becomes. You have seen so many skills: communication skills, business skills, problem solving skills, analytical skills, so many categories that could complicate things for you. But I would say let's not go there, and I will keep it very simple and short for you. Whenever you talk about skill, you can just generally categorize them into three categories, and that would be more than enough. First category would be your core skill. So when I say your core skills are the skills that are needed for you to do your main job or the tasks or whatever you do. So those are your core skills. Then you could have some common skills, and those are again the skills that are needed to do your job. But if you do not have common skills, but you have the core skills, you can still get the job done. However, the efficiency of the job done would not that be good. So that means you always have to develop two kinds of skills. You have to develop core skills, and you have to develop some common skills. I generally put another category and I call it differentiating skills. These are the skills that are not your core skills, that are not your common skills, but these are the skills that go on top of it and help you make a differentiating factor in your skills profile. Now, let's deep dive into the example so you can understand them in a better way. So for example, you're a developer. So as I said that you would have some core skills. So your core skills would be problem solving, analytical thinking, programming, and of course, programming in a certain language. So if you're a Java developer, you need to develop those Java skills. You need to know about Java frameworks and etc. etc. So these are all your core skills. Then you would have some common skills. Common skills could generally include your communication skills, your stakeholder skills, your documentation skills, your time management skills, team player skills. These are the skills that are your common skills that you require to do your job. Let's assume for a moment that you are a good developer, you have all the core skills, however, you do not have some common skills, you can still get the job done, which is very good, but lacking these common skills will ultimately have an impact on your profile and on your career. So you need to classify these skills like this. And again, this classification is not carved in stone. It is absolutely possible that what is core skill for you today would not be a core skill for you tomorrow. So skills are always evolving and you can always reshuffle. It is also possible that what is a common skill for you might become a core skill for you. And it is also possible that what is core skill for you might become a common skill for you. So to keep it simple, this categorization only helps us understand better. You can just disregard these categorizations and you will still be able to understand that what are the skills that you need or you do not need. This differentiating skill set is basically the skill set that sets you apart, that creates the difference between you and others. So if you are in a team, if you are 5 developers working in a team, so all the developers would have some core skills. All of them would have common skills. The question is, what additional skills you have that sets you apart from your peers, colleagues, or competitors, or in general in the market? So you always need to work on these differentiating skills. You need to identify these skills and then get going from there. I would try to make videos on this to go into more details to help you explain and better understand what do we mean by this kind of skills. For example, this could be one of the skills that you are a developer or architecturing a solution might not be your core skill yet. However, how nice it would be if you develop this skill in advance. This is an example of you demonstrating a differentiating skill. Though I'm a developer, but I can also work as an architect when need be. So this is the differentiating skill. And then you have different levels of proficiencies for those skills, but we would be discussing this in upcoming videos and not today. Now let us come back to the other topic that we brought in the beginning, that is talent. We said that skills plus talent is equal to your ability to do something. Let us assume that you said that you do not have any talent, so the value for talent is 0. And you want to understand what is your talent. So the best way to do or to identify your talent is basically to ask your peers, to ask your family, to look back at your life and understand that what are your natural abilities? What are you good at? Are you good at managing people? Are you good at paying attention to details? Are you good at analytics? Are you good at mathematics? Are you good at retaining information? It could be anything. It doesn't necessarily has to be technical or non-technical. It could be anything. And it has to do with your personality, by the way. So talent is very much associated with your personality. It's your natural ability to do something. And let's assume for a moment that even by talking to your friends, your family, your peers, you're still not able to determine that what is your talent. Then there is another way to find your natural abilities, and that is to do some assessments. There are so many psychometric assessments available today that you can do that will help you determine your personality type. Once you have identified your personality types, you would also be able to identify your talents, or in other words, traits. Now, traits is another thing which is associated with personality, but I would not confuse you here. The idea is very simple. If you do not know what you are good at, what you are talented at, seek some help, perform some psychometric assessments or online assessments that are available that will help you determine your talents, and then ultimately you would know it. But I find it hard to believe that you do not know your talent. So if you have spent 20-25 years of your life, by this time you should know what are you good at. Now, why all of this is important? Why have we spent so much effort in trying to discuss skill and talent? The answer is very simple. Whenever we are looking for a promotion or looking for a job change, or whenever someone is evaluating you for a new position, they are ultimately looking at your ability to do something. They actually look at it if you're able to do that certain thing or not. Of course, in some organization, they give you tasks, they give you a couple of assignments, and that's the reason you have probation period, because they look at your ability if you can do that or not. As we said, ability is basically driven by your skills and your talent. And of course, then other parameters also play a crucial role. For example, experience, reference, education, certifications, all these parameters come along. But to keep it simple, your ability to do something is basically driven by your skill and your talent. and you get the job based on your ability. It is possible that you did not had any relevant experience, but you still get the opportunity. And how do you get that opportunity is basically because of your skill or your ability to do something. You demonstrated those abilities during your interview. That's how the other person is convinced that given this scenario, you are able to do that. So we get promotions, we get new projects, we get new jobs. This is our abilities and of course our proven record. And if we are able to demonstrate that we are able to do it, then that means we are good. And that's how the world moves. I hope you found this video helpful. And for such interesting videos, stay tuned. If you have any questions or queries, feel free to ask and I would be more than happy to answer. See you in the next video.